They arrived in the dark water of a single lake, each one smaller than a fingernail and soft enough to crush between two fingers. Within a few years, they had spread across an entire continent, sealing pipes, sinking navigation buoys, and draining billions of dollars from everyone who tried to stop them. Engineers answered with chemicals, scrapers, and steel. Yet the most powerful response to this invasion was never designed by a human hand. It was already swimming in the water, waiting for its moment. The story begins in 1988 in a shallow body of water called Lake St. Clair, tucked between Lake Huron and Lake Erie on the border of Michigan and Ontario. A researcher pulled up a sample of mud and shells from the bottom and noticed something that did not belong. It was a small striped shellfish, no longer than a thumbnail, marked with the dark zigzag bands that would give it its name. The zebra mussel had arrived in North America, and the quiet lakes of the continent would never be the same again. It did not swim here, it did not crawl across the land. It traveled the way so many invaders do, hidden inside the ballast tanks of ocean freighters. Ships crossing from Europe and Western Asia take on enormous volumes of water in distant ports to keep their hulls steady and balanced as they cross the sea. In that water floated the microscopic larvae of a mussel native to the rivers and inland seas of the Caspian and Black Sea region. When those ships reached the Great Lakes and flushed their tanks to take on cargo, they released a living thing into a world that had never met it before. A world that had no defenses prepared and no idea how to fight back. This is the hidden danger of global shipping. For more than a century, vessels have been quietly carrying small passengers from one ocean to another, larvae and eggs and spores riding in the dark of a ballast tank. Most of those passengers die, but every so often, one finds a new home that suits it perfectly, a place with the right temperature, the right food, and no natural enemies. For the zebra mussel, the Great Lakes were that perfect home. The water was cool and rich. The bottom was full of hard surfaces to cling to. And nothing here had evolved alongside this creature, which meant nothing here knew how to keep it in check. What makes the zebra mussel so dangerous is not its size. It is its arithmetic. A single female can release up to 1 million eggs in a year. The larvae, called veligers, are so tiny they are nearly invisible, and they drift on the lake currents for weeks before they settle. When they finally come to rest, they cling. Each mussel grows a bundle of tough fibers called bisal threads, anchoring itself to almost any hard surface it can find. Rocks, docks, boat hulls, the shells of native mussels, the smooth inside wall of a pipe. And once one generation takes hold, the next settles on top of it, layer upon layer, until a single square meter of lake bottom can hold tens of thousands of individuals stacked together in a living crust. From that one shallow lake, the spread was breathtaking to watch. Within a decade, zebra mussels had colonized all 5 Great Lakes and pushed down into the Mississippi River system, hitching rides on barges and on the hulls and trailers of recreational boats moving from one lake to the next. They reached the Hudson River in the east. They reached the Tennessee and the Ohio. They turned up in reservoirs scattered across the American heartland, hundreds of miles from any shipping lane. A creature that had crossed an entire ocean by accident was now conquering a continent under its own power, carried by the very people who feared it. For a while, the most visible change was strangely beautiful. Zebra mussels are filter feeders. Each one draws lake water in through one siphon and pushes it back out through another, straining out the tiny floating plants and particles that drift in the current. A single mussel can filter about 1 liter of water every day, and a dense colony can process an astonishing volume. In some lakes, the water transformed before people's eyes, turning from a murky green soup into something startlingly clear. Swimmers and boaters could suddenly see 10, 15, even 20 feet down to a bottom that had been hidden for as long as anyone could remember. To many, it looked like the lakes were getting cleaner, but that clarity was a warning, not a gift. The microscopic plankton the mussels were stripping out of the water was not pollution. It was the foundation of the entire food web. Those tiny floating plants fed the tiny floating animals, which fed the small fish, which fed the larger fish, which fed the birds and the people. By filtering the water until it ran clear, the mussels were quietly pulling the bottom block out of a tall and ancient tower. Everything stacked above it began to wobble. Native fish that depended on open water plankton started to decline. Native mussels, smothered under blankets of zebra mussels growing directly on their shells, began to suffocate and die. The lakes were not becoming healthier. They were being hollowed out from the bottom up. Then came the damage that no one could ignore. Zebra mussels are drawn to moving water, the steady, reliable current that flows through pipes, and that is exactly the kind of water that power plants, factories, and city water systems depend on. The mussels colonize the intake structures, packing themselves into the openings until the flow slowed from a rush to a trickle. In Monroe, Michigan, a large power plant drawing from Lake Erie found one of its intake tunnels so thoroughly choked with mussels that the plant had to be shut down so crews could clear it out by hand. Up and down the region, drinking water treatment plants and electric utilities faced the same relentless enemy and the same impossible cleaning bills, season after season with no end in sight. The numbers climbed quickly, and they climbed high. Early projections warned that zebra mussels could cost the American economy as much as $5 billion over a single decade, a staggering figure that was repeated in newspapers and government reports until it became fixed in the public memory of the invasion. Later, more careful and more cautious studies focused on specific industries and tried to measure exactly what had been spent. They found that drinking water and electric power facilities alone had spent more than $267 million dealing with the mussels over roughly 15 years. Whichever figure you trust, the lesson was identical. This tiny, soft-bodied animal had become one of the most expensive invasive species in the history of the United States. So, America fought back, and it fought hard, and it fought with everything it had. Operators poured chlorine and other chemicals into intake pipes to kill the drifting larvae before they could settle and grow. They sent divers down into the cold and the dark to scrape thick colonies off underwater structures by hand. They installed fine screens and filters, coated metal surfaces with toxic paints designed to repel anything that tried to attach, blasted clogged pipes with jets of high-pressure water, and in some places ran scalding hot water through their systems until the mussels inside could not survive the heat. Entire engineering specialties grew up around a single goal, which was simply to keep one small creature from taking hold. Some of it worked, at least in one place, at least for a season. A treated pipe could be kept clear. A single intake could be defended through a summer. But the lake on the other side of the wall never stopped producing mussels. For every colony scraped away by a diver, 1 million more larvae were already drifting in the current, ready to settle the moment the chemicals washed out and the surfaces went quiet. The fight was endless. It was enormously expensive, and it never once produced a final victory. It only ever bought time, one cleaning, one treatment, one diver's shift at a time. And here is the part of the story that almost no one was watching. While engineers waged their war at the intake pipes, something completely different was unfolding out in the open water. The native creatures of these lakes, the fish and the birds and the diving ducks that had lived in this place for thousands of years, were beginning to notice the newcomer too. And some of them were beginning to discover that this strange little invader, this expensive and infuriating pest, was not a threat to them at all. It was food. And the response that humans could never buy with $5 billion, nature was about to provide for nothing. The first to answer were the birds. Every autumn, the skies above the Great Lakes fill with the rush of migrating waterfowl moving south ahead of the cold. Among them are the diving ducks, a group of birds built for a life beneath the surface. Where the familiar dabbling ducks tip forward and feed near the top of the water, diving ducks vanish completely, pushing themselves down with powerful legs set far back on their bodies, propelling through the cold toward the lake floor. They are submarines with feathers. And for these birds, the sudden explosion of zebra mussels across the shallow reefs and bays was not a disaster at all. It was the single largest banquet they had ever encountered. When scientists examined what these ducks were actually eating after the invasion, the results were astonishing. In the lesser scaup, a small, agile diving duck with a steel blue bill and golden eyes, zebra mussels made up more than 94% of the diet by weight. These were not birds sampling a curiosity. They had reorganized their entire feeding lives around the new shellfish, building winter after winter on the abundance of the invader. And the lesser scaup was not alone. The greater scaup, the common goldeneye, the bufflehead, and the redhead all turned to the mussels in great numbers, descending on the dense beds that now carpeted the shallows like a freshly set table. Picture the scene from below the surface. A raft of ducks rests on the cold grey water in the thin light of a November morning. One by one, they dip their heads, tuck their wings, and disappear, kicking downward through water made strangely clear by the very creatures they are hunting. They reach the bottom, wrench the clinging mussels loose with their bills, and swallow them whole, shell and all. The crushing happens later, deep inside the bird, in a thick muscular chamber called the gizzard that grinds the hard shells to fragments against grit the duck has swallowed for exactly this purpose. Then the bird drives back to the surface, breathes, rests a moment, and dives again. A single duck can swallow many thousands of mussels in a single day, and a flock on a productive lake can number in the thousands of birds. In the places where these ducks gathered in force, their effect on the mussels could actually be measured. Beds that had blanketed the lake bottom in autumn were thinned dramatically by the time the ice broke in spring. The ducks could never clear an entire Great Lake, for no creature on Earth could eat at that scale. But in the shallow bays and along the rocky reefs where they concentrated, they pressed the mussels back hard year after year, removing tons of living shellfish from the system. And they did it all for free, on their own ancient schedule, following an instinct far older than any pipe or power plant. No agency had to fund them. No engineer had to deploy them. They simply arrived on the wind, ate their fill, and moved on, as their ancestors had done every single autumn for longer than humans had lived on these shores. The second native to rise to the challenge spent its entire life beneath the surface, and it carried its weapon hidden inside its own throat. It is called the freshwater drum, a stout, deep-bodied silver fish that haunts the bottoms of rivers and lakes across the middle of the continent. It earns its curious name from a sound. The males possess special muscles that vibrate against the swim bladder, producing a low, resonant drumming that carries through the water and can sometimes be heard from a boat above. For most of its long history, the freshwater drum was an unremarkable fish, easy to overlook, rarely prized by anglers, simply part of the background of the deep water. But the drum was hiding a secret, and the arrival of the zebra mussel would turn that secret into something close to a superpower. Tucked deep in the back of the drum's throat is a remarkable structure called a pharyngeal mill. It is a set of heavy bony plates studded with teeth, positioned where the throat meets the gut, and it works exactly like a built-in nutcracker. While most fish must swallow their prey whole or shred it with the teeth in their mouths, the freshwater drum can grind hard shells to powder deep inside its own body, long after the prey has been swallowed. When zebra mussels began carpeting the lake floor by the millions, the drum found itself almost perfectly equipped to take advantage of a food source that most other fish could not even touch. But the most fascinating detail is how that grinding equipment changes as the fish grows older. Scientists who carefully studied the drum's pharyngeal teeth discovered that they transform across the animal's lifetime. In a young drum, the teeth are slender, fine, and sharp, shaped like a comb and suited for gripping soft, small prey. As the fish matures, the teeth begin to shift, growing broader and blunter and stronger. And in a large adult, they become thick, rounded, molar-like crushers built for a single demanding purpose, which is to shatter armor. Researchers trace this slow transformation through distinct stages, from the fine and pointed form of youth through an intermediate shape to the heavy grinding mill of a full-grown fish. There was even a clear threshold. The studies found that a freshwater drum generally needed to reach a length of about 265 millimeters, a little over 10 inches, before its crushing teeth grew powerful enough to make zebra mussels a serious part of its diet. Below that size, the shells were simply too tough, and the fish could not break them efficiently. But once a drum grew past that mark, it became a dedicated mussel grinder, cruising slowly along the bottom and crushing the invaders one after another, hour after hour. In the warm western basin of Lake Erie, where the mussels grew thickest of all, the freshwater drum became one of their most committed and effective natural predators. It was a native fish that had been quietly carrying exactly the right tool for tens of thousands of years, a tool that had no special purpose until the day a problem finally arrived that matched it perfectly. The third native hero did not start out with the right tool at all. To survive, it had to change. The lake whitefish is one of the most important fish in the entire Great Lakes system, a sleek, silver, deep-bodied species that has fed both the ecosystem and human communities for countless generations. Long before the cities and the freighters, indigenous peoples relied on its rich flesh, and for more than a century, it has anchored commercial fisheries across the region. For almost all of its history, the life of the whitefish revolved around a single, humble creature. Across the soft, deep bottoms of the cold lakes lived a small, shrimp-like animal called Diporia, an oil-rich amphipod packed with fat and energy. To a whitefish, Diporia was the perfect meal, dense with calories and easy to find in vast numbers. The whitefish grew large and healthy and abundant on this one prey. It was the quiet engine that drove the entire fishery. Then the mussels changed everything. As zebra mussels and their close cousins, the quagga mussels, spread across the deep lake floors and filtered more and more energy out of the water, the Diporea population went into a steep and stunning collapse. Across vast stretches of lake bottom, where the little amphipods had once swarmed in uncountable numbers, they simply disappeared. Scientists still debate the precise chain of cause and effect, but the consequence was impossible to miss. The whitefish had lost the food that had sustained their kind for centuries. For a fish so deeply specialized on one prey, this should have been an extinction-level disaster. And at first, it truly was hard. With Diporea gone, many whitefish grew thinner, slower, and less productive, their bodies showing the strain of a vanished food supply. But then the species did something that ecosystems are capable of in ways we constantly underestimate. It adapted. Denied the prey that had defined it, the whitefish turned to whatever the strange new world now offered. They began eating the very mussels that had triggered the collapse, plucking small zebra mussels straight off the bottom and processing the shells as best they could. And they turned to yet another invader as well, the round goby, a small, bottom-dwelling fish that had arrived in the very same wave of ballast water and that fed heavily on mussels itself. In doing so, the whitefish stitched itself directly into a brand new food web that had not existed a generation earlier. It could not bring back the lost world of Diporea, but it found a way to keep living in the world it had been handed, drawing its energy from the invaders along two different paths, by eating the mussels directly and by eating the gobies that had grown fat on those same mussels. It was not a clean or a complete victory. The whitefish of today are not always the rich, heavy, oil-laden fish that the old fishermen remember, but survival itself was a genuine achievement, and it revealed something profound about these waters. The lakes were not simply collapsing into ruin. Quietly, beneath the surface, they were rewiring themselves into a new and unfamiliar pattern. And the rewiring did not stop with the whitefish. To understand how deep it ran, you have to follow the round goby, because that single fish reveals how completely the invasion rebuilt the machinery of the lakes. The round goby was the second uninvited guest, arriving in the ballast water just as the mussels had. A small, big-headed bottom fish with an appetite perfectly suited to the new world. Where most native fish struggled even to crack a zebra mussel, the goby specialized in them, prying the shellfish loose and crushing them with strong throat teeth of its own. The mussels were converting the lake's energy into living shells across the entire bottom, and the goby had found a way to unlock that energy and turn it back into fish. Goby populations exploded across the Great Lakes, in some places reaching densities of dozens of fish per square meter along the rocky reefs. And that explosion did not go unnoticed by the predators above. The smallmouth bass, a prized native sport fish, discovered that the gobies were abundant, easy to catch, and rich with nourishment, and in many areas, the bass shifted to feeding on them heavily. Walleye learned the same lesson. Lake trout, yellow perch, even fish-eating birds and water snakes along the shoreline began to take advantage of the new abundance. A strange and elegant pathway had quietly opened up. Energy that the mussels had pulled out of the open water and locked away into shells on the bottom was now flowing back up to the top of the food web, carried on the backs of the gobies into the very predators that anglers and ecosystems care about most. It was, in its own way, a kind of accidental restoration. The open water food web that the mussels had hollowed out was being partly replaced by a new food web anchored to the lake floor, running from mussel to goby to predator. The lakes were not the same as they had been before, and they were not empty either. They had become something new, a freshly assembled system in which the invaders had been folded into the diets of the natives, feeding them, sustaining them, and in a strange sense being put to work by them. It would be easy, and it would feel good, to end the story right here, with nature quietly winning and the native creatures pushing the invader back. But the truth of any ecosystem is rarely that simple, and honesty demands that we tell the harder part of the tale as well. As scientists studied the invaded lakes more and more closely, they uncovered a troubling and unexpected side effect of all this filtering and feeding. Zebra mussels, by clearing the water and reshaping the lake bottom and rerouting the flow of energy through the system, were also changing the way a dangerous element moved through the food web. That element was mercury. Mercury occurs naturally in the environment, and it also falls from polluted air into lakes and rivers, where certain bacteria can transform it into a form called methylmercury that living tissue readily absorbs. Once mercury enters a fish, it does not leave. It builds up steadily over the animal's life, and it concentrates further at every step up the food chain, a relentless process called biomagnification. A large predatory fish carries the accumulated mercury of every smaller creature it has ever eaten. A study published in 2024 took a careful look at lakes that zebra mussels had invaded and compared them directly to similar lakes that remained free of the creature. The findings were genuinely sobering. In the invaded lakes, walleye, one of the most popular fish on the dinner table across the region, carried mercury concentrations roughly 72% higher than in the uninvaded waters. Yellow perch, another beloved catch, showed increases that were sharper still. The practical consequence reached all the way from the lake bottom to the dinner plate. Because the fish living in invaded lakes now carried more mercury in their flesh, the public health advisories that warn people to limit how much fish they eat began to apply at smaller fish sizes than they had before. A walleye that would once have been considered safe to eat might now trip an advisory. The mussels, simply by filtering the water and reorganizing the food web, had inadvertently turned up the dial on a toxin that matters directly to human health, especially for children and for those who eat from these waters often. This is the uncomfortable balance that sits at the very heart of the story. The native ducks, the freshwater drum, and the lake whitefish were all pushing back against the invasion, consuming mussels by the millions and weaving them into the living web of the lakes. That response was real, and it mattered. But the same great transformation that fed those creatures also carried hidden costs that no one had asked for and no one had foreseen. Nature was not simply repairing the damage and restoring the past. It was negotiating with the invasion, striking a new and complicated bargain, and arriving at an equilibrium that was neither the lost world of before nor the total catastrophe that had been feared. It was something altogether new, and like most new things, it was a mixture of gain and loss. Step back from the details now, and a much larger picture comes into focus. When the zebra mussel first arrived, people imagined two possible futures for the lakes. In the first, the invader would be defeated, scrubbed out of the water by sheer human effort and ingenuity. In the second, it would destroy everything it touched, leaving the once living lakes barren, clear, and empty. Neither of those futures actually came to pass. Instead, something far more interesting and far more instructive happened. The ecosystem absorbed the tremendous shock, refused to simply die, and began to reorganize itself around the permanent presence of the newcomer. The mussels were never eliminated, and they never will be. They are still out there today by the trillions, blanketing reefs and pipes and riverbeds across half the continent. The chemicals and the scrapers and the filters still run at the intake structures because that particular fight genuinely never ends. But out in the open water, in the vast wild spaces where no human hand could ever reach, the native species mounted a response that no engineer could have designed and no budget could have funded. The diving ducks turned the mussel beds into a winter feeding ground spread across thousands of miles. The freshwater drum brought to bear a crushing mill it had carried, unused for this purpose, across uncounted ages. The lake whitefish reinvented its own diet from scratch to survive a world turned upside down. And countless other creatures, the gobies and the perch and the walleye and the unseen bacteria in the sediment, all shifted and adjusted in turn, each one responding to the others in a vast, sprawling, completely unplanned act of collective adaptation. This is what living systems do when we are not looking. They are not fragile museum displays, frozen in place and waiting helplessly to be shattered by the first disturbance. They are dynamic, restless, deeply patient, and astonishingly inventive. Push them hard, and they do not simply break and surrender. They bend, they shuffle their pieces, they experiment and fail, and experiment again, and slowly reassemble themselves into new arrangements that can hold together and endure. The result is almost never a return to exactly the way things were before, but it is also almost never the end. More often, it is the beginning of something different, something that no one would have predicted and no one designed. Humans spent vast sums and vast effort fighting the zebra mussel, and that work mattered. It protected the pipes and the plants and the water systems that millions of people depend on every single day, and it should not be dismissed. But the deeper response, the one that reached into the whole living web of the lakes, came from creatures who asked for nothing and were paid nothing, who simply did what they had always done, and who in doing so revealed a power in the natural world that is far too easy to forget. There is a quiet and durable hope in all of this. We so often tell the story of invasive species as a tale of pure and permanent loss, a record of damage that can never be undone. And the losses are real, and they deserve to be mourned. The world of these lakes as it existed before the mussel will not return in our lifetimes, and perhaps not for many lifetimes to come. But the same waters that suffered the invasion also showed us something genuinely worth holding on to. Life is not waiting passively to be rescued by us. Given even the smallest opening, even the slightest chance, it pushes back with a force and a creativity that can take your breath away. A duck folds its wings and drops into the cold. A silverfish grinds a shell to dust deep in its throat. A whitefish learns, against every expectation, to live on the very thing that nearly destroyed it. So the next time you stand at the edge of one of these Great Lakes and watch the surface ripple under a wide autumn sky, remember what is happening just beneath it, out of sight. A slow, patient, unstoppable act of repair is underway down there, carried out by creatures who will never know that anyone might call them heroes. They are not trying to save the world. They are simply living, doing what they were built to do. And in that simple, stubborn living, they remind us of something we should never have forgotten. Nature, when we give it even half a chance, is far more resilient, far more resourceful, and far more full of surprises than we ever dared to imagine. The water is clear, the work goes quietly on, and life somehow, against everything, keeps finding its way forward.